The summer sun beat down on the parched earth as Cole Hartman rode into the edge of the burned-out settlement. The air smelled of smoke and silence, the kind that seeps into your bones and lingers long after the wind shifts. Ash clung to the wooden frames of what used to be homes. The raiders had taken everyone except her. She stood alone beside a toppled well, hair tangled, dress torn, eyes fierce despite the dust streaking her face. Worthless, a traitor scoffed as Cole dismounted. She didn't flinch. Cole had seen that look before, the kind born from losing everything but refusing to bow. Her posture was straight, unyielding, even as her bare feet pressed into the hot dirt. There was no plea in her expression, no silent request for rescue, just the quiet defiance of someone who had survived the unimaginable. The traitor stood with a smirk, holding the reins of his mule, clearly waiting for Cole to move on. Cole tossed his reins toward the man without hesitation. "I'll take her," he said flatly, his tone leaving no room for argument. The traitor snorted but caught the reins, shrugging as if letting go of something with no worth. Cole's eyes stayed on her as they started walking toward his horse. He noticed her steps measured, steady, no stumble, despite the heat and exhaustion. She didn't ask where they were going, didn't offer her name, and he didn't push. Cole had learned long ago that people who'd seen too much spoke when they were ready, if ever. Around them, the land stretched wide and unforgiving, the sky a burning blue dome overhead. His boots crunched against the dry earth, matching the quiet rhythm of her bare feet beside him. When they reached the shade of a scraggly mesquite tree, Cole paused and untied a canteen from his saddle. He offered it to her, watching for any flicker of trust or refusal. She hesitated just long enough for him to see the battle in her mind, then took it, drinking with slow, deliberate gulps. When she handed it back, their eyes met for the first time without the chaos of the settlement around them. There was strength there, but also something fractured. Hidden deep. They mounted up, her riding behind him without needing instruction. Cole didn't speak. The steady clop of hooves filled the silence. The trail ahead stretched into a horizon blurred with heat waves. He could feel the tension in her frame, the way she sat upright, hands lightly gripping his belt but never leaning in for support. She was riding away from what had been taken from her, but not toward anything she could name. Cole kept the pace steady, letting the land and the rhythm of travel start to strip away the sharp edges of fear. By late afternoon, the sun's bite had dulled, shadows stretching longer over the rolling scrubland. Cole guided the horse toward a narrow creek, its water glinting weakly under the light. He dismounted and offered her a hand, which she ignored, sliding down on her own. At the water's edge, she knelt, cupping her hands to drink. Cole stood a few steps away, letting her have the space. In moments like this, people needed distance more than comfort. He took stock of her again, not as a stranger from a burned settlement, but as someone who'd just been wrenched from one life and shoved into another without choice. Her dress, once a deep earth tone, was now torn and faded. A leather thong still tied back her hair, though strands fell loose, curling under her jaw. Her wrists bore faint red marks, bindings from earlier. He guessed. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. The details didn't matter yet. What mattered was that she was still here when she'd finished drinking. She turned to him with the faintest nod, acknowledging his role, without gratitude or debt. Cole respected that. "We'll ride until sundown," he said, and she simply stepped toward the horse, waiting for him to mount first. They rode on, the air cooling enough for the scent of sage to rise from the dry earth. The land here was as open as a page, nothing to hide behind, no walls, no safety except in the miles you could put between yourself and the trouble at your back. The burned-out settlement faded from his mind, replaced by the thought of what came next. He knew he couldn't just leave her at the nearest town. She'd be vulnerable again, prey to traitors and men who saw her as a thing to be dealt for. But keeping her with him meant responsibility, meant drawing the attention of those who'd left her behind in the first place. Cole had dealt with worse, but this was different. The difference was the way she hadn't begged, hadn't even asked. Somehow, that made him feel he owed her more. As the sun began its slow descent, turning the horizon molten orange, Cole spotted a ridge that would make good shelter for the night. They dismounted in its shadow, the horse grazing quietly nearby. Cole gathered dry brush and struck flint, coaxing a small fire to life. She sat a few paces away, legs drawn up, arms resting lightly on her knees. In the fire's glow, her face looked younger, though the eyes remained the same, watchful, guarded. He passed her a strip of dried venison, and she took it without a word. They ate in silence, the crackle of fire their only conversation. Above them, the first stars pricked through the indigo sky. Cole leaned back, resting on his elbows, letting the quiet of the land settle around them. She hadn't told him her name, but he wasn't in a hurry. Names could wait. What mattered was that she was alive, and in this moment, safe. Somewhere in the back of his mind, though he knew this wasn't the end of trouble. If the raiders had left her behind, it was either by mistake or by some reason he hadn't yet uncovered. She shifted slightly, her eyes catching the firelight. "Why?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. The question hung between them. He knew she wasn't asking why he'd stopped, why he'd spoken to the traitor, or even why he'd brought her along. She was asking something deeper, why a man would bother with someone the world had already written off. Cole stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. Because no one's worthless, he said, and he meant it. For the first time since they'd left the settlement, something in her gaze eased. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the first crack in the wall she'd built. She leaned back slightly, her posture no longer sharp with readiness to flee. Cole didn't press further. The land had its own way of working. On people miles of horizon could do what words couldn't. Tomorrow, they'd ride again, and maybe then she'd tell him her story. For now, the night was enough. As the fire burned low, Cole took the first watch. Coyotes yipped somewhere beyond the ridge, their calls rising and fading. The woman still nameless curled under the blanket he'd handed her, her breathing slow and even. Cole sat with his rifle across his knees, his eyes scanning the darkness. The settlement's silence still clung to him, but so did her defiance. He didn't know what kind of fight lay ahead, but he knew one thing: walking away from her had never been an option. The fire crackled between them, casting restless shadows across the ground. Cole didn't press her for more words, and she didn't offer any. In the quiet, the land spoke instead a distant howl of a coyote, the soft rustle of wind in the dry grass, the fading scent of smoke still clinging to her hair. He studied her without making it obvious. The set of her jaw was unyielding, but her eyes betrayed the exhaustion she carried. She wasn't ready to trust him. Cole knew that trust wasn't asked for in moments like this. It was earned in the miles ahead. When dawn's first light crept over the ridge, Cole was already saddling the horses. She rose silently, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders, hair falling loose in dark waves. Her bare feet touched the cold dirt before she stepped into her worn shoes. He handed her a strip of dried meat, and though she hesitated, hunger won. They set off down the trail, the morning air sharp and thin. Cole kept an easy pace, mindful of her smaller steps. Somewhere in his chest, a thought he didn't want to name began to stir. He wasn't just leading her to safety. By midday, they reached a shallow creek. She knelt to drink, cupping the water with shaking hands. Cole watched her, noting the faint bruises along her wrists. The trader's voice still rang in his head, worthless. It made his jaw tighten. She caught him looking and straightened. You think I'm weak? She asked suddenly. The words were blunt, but her tone carried challenge, not shame. Cole shook his head. I think you've stood longer than most could. For the first time, a flicker of surprise crossed her face, as if she hadn't expected anything but judgment. That night, the wind picked up, carrying the dry scent of sage and distant rain. They camped beneath a rocky overhang, the firelight painting her profile in golden shadow. She finally told 8:14, 9:52 a.m., 92334. 9,881,639. Two halves, him, her name is. Her voice was quiet but steady, as though speaking it reclaimed a part of herself she'd been forced to give up. Cole repeated it once under his breath, committing it to memory. Why did you take me? She asked again, this time softer, less guarded. Cole didn't look at her, but his words were clear. Because someone had to. She didn't answer, but her gaze lingered on him. By the third day, the land began to change. Rolling hills softened into grasslands, and the air grew warmer. Cole knew they'd soon reach his ranch, a place he had built from dust and stubbornness. As they rode, Ayoka scanned the horizon with cautious eyes, her hands gripping the saddle horn tighter than necessary. You can leave when we get there, Cole said finally. No one will stop you. She didn't reply, but her shoulders eased just a little, as if the choice whether she took it or not was worth something in itself. The silence between them was no longer heavy. When the ranch finally came into view, Cole half expected her to flinch at the sight of men working the corrals. Instead, she sat straighter, taking in every detail, the fences, the barn, the sound of horses calling to one another. A few ranch hands glanced their way, their expressions curious but not unkind. Cole dismounted and offered her a hand down. She refused it, sliding off the horse herself with quiet dignity. You'll be safe here, he said. She met his gaze for a long moment before giving a small nod, the faintest hint of trust flickering in her eyes. Inside the ranch house, Cole stoked the hearth and set out bread and stew. Ayoka stood just inside the doorway, scanning the room as if searching for threats. You can sit, he said, motioning toward the table. She obeyed, though her posture stayed tense. As they ate, Cole told her of the land, the herds, and the men who worked here. She listened but offered little in return, except for the occasional question, small things about the cattle, the seasons, the work. It wasn't much, but to Cole, it was proof she hadn't shut the world out completely. That night, he gave her his sister's old room, untouched since the day she'd left for the city. Ayoka lingered in the doorway, fingertips brushing the quilt on the bed. It's yours as long as you need it, Cole said, leaning on the frame. She glanced at him once, her expression unreadable, then stepped inside without a word. He closed the door quietly behind her, knowing she needed space more than conversation. Outside, the crickets sang, and for the first time in weeks. The ranch felt like it was holding its breath. Days passed, and the rhythm of the ranch began to weave her into its pace. Ayoka fed chickens at dawn, helped in the kitchen, and sometimes stood by the corral, watching the horses run. She didn't smile, not yet, but there was less steel in her eyes. One afternoon, Cole found her mending a torn shirt by the porch steps. "Didn't know you could sew," he said. She didn't look up. "Didn't know I'd need to," she replied, a touch of wryness in her voice. It caught him off guard. Humor, however small, was a step toward something more, but the piece was fragile. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, a lone rider appeared on the ridge. Cole recognized the brand on his saddle. It belonged to the traders. His grip tightened on the rifle, leaning by the door. Ayoka froze, her gaze fixed on the stranger. The rider didn't approach, just watched for a long moment before turning away. When Cole looked back at her, she was trembling. "They won't take you," he said firmly. She met his eyes, searching them for truth. For the first time, she seemed to believe him. That night, the fire in the hearth burned low, and Ayoka sat across from him, the shadows dancing between them. "When they called me worthless," she said, voice raw, "it was easier to believe them than fight." Cole shook his head. "You were never what they said." Her hands clenched in her lap, and for a moment, the fierce woman he'd first seen at the well returned. "Then what am I?" she asked. Cole didn't hesitate. "Someone worth standing for." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. This time it was full, almost alive. Winter came early that year, draping the land in white. Ayoka moved through the ranch with more ease now, her steps confident, her words no longer rationed. Sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, Cole caught her smiling at small things, a newborn calf, finding its legs, the way the frost sparkled on the fence line at dawn. He never told her, but those moments meant more to him than any trade or herd he'd ever owned. Somewhere between the burned settlement and the snow-covered ranch, she had stopped being a stranger, and he had stopped being just her rescuer. By spring, the land was green again, and life on the ranch settled into its steady rhythm. One morning, Ayoka joined Cole at the corral, watching the horses kick up dust in the warm light. "I thought I'd leave," she admitted quietly. "But every road I picture leads back here." Cole didn't look at her, but his chest tightened. "Then stay," he said simply. She studied him for a long moment before nodding. The wind carried the scent of blooming sage, and in that unspoken agreement, the past loosened its grip. Neither of them had planned this, but some things were worth keeping.